This is Jacob's Algebra, Chapter 10, Lesson 6, Part 2. We had just finished number 7, Part D on the Part 1 video. Remember, number 7 is just like number 14 that I assigned as homework. The next problem we're going to look at is number 8. Okay, number 8 says, if possible, write each of the following polynomials as the square of a binomial. So when you're looking at any of these, the first thing you ought to do is check to see, is this something that has the right form to be a binomial? So let's look at part A. We have x squared plus 12x plus 36. So our first term is something that we can write as a square, x squared. Our last term is something that we can write as a square. Our middle term is even, so that's good. Is this the double of the product of our first term and our last term? 2 times x times 6 is 12x, so that means that we can write this as the square of a binomial, and it would be x plus 6 squared, because our first term was an x that we squared and our last term was a 6 that we squared. Okay, let's look at part B. For part B, we have x squared minus 2xy, sorry, the minus didn't write, plus y squared. Okay, so we start off with the square of an x. We end up with the square of a y. In the middle, we're subtracting double the product of x and y. So that certainly looks like the square of a binomial. Our first term is an x, our second term is a y, and we are subtracting them because this is a negative in the middle. Okay, look at part C. Part C, we have 4x squared plus 4x plus 1. Okay, so our first term is 2x squared. Our last term is 1 squared. And our middle term ought to be the double of the product of our first term and our last term. And 2 times 2x plus times 1 is indeed 4x. So that means that we can write this as 2x plus 1 quantity squared. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is part D. Part D is x squared minus 9x plus 81. Now on this one, while our first term can indeed be written as a square and our last term can be written as a square, notice that our middle term has an odd coefficient. If the middle term is not even, then you cannot write it as the square of a binomial because the middle term is always the double of the product of the first term and the last term. So if this is an odd number in the middle, it cannot be written as the square of a binomial. So this one would be not possible. So I recommend when you are doing number 15, which is just like this one, that for number 15 you check each one of them first and see if you have a number in the middle that's odd, because if the number in the middle is odd, then it is not possible to write it as the square of a binomial. Now we're going to do just a couple more examples from number 8. The next one we're going to look at is part F, which is 16x squared plus 40x minus 25. This one cannot be written as the product of a binomial. Why not? Because the sign in front of our last term is a negative. It has to end with a positive. Remember, a plus b quantity squared is a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. It has a positive last term. A minus b quantity squared is a squared minus 2ab, but it's also plus b squared. So our last term has to be positive. If your last term is negative, you cannot write it as the square of a binomial. So for this one, you would write not possible. So those are the two things that you need to check for before you actually do any real math on number 15, is check to see if your last number is negative, because if it's negative, then it is not possible to write that polynomial as the square of a binomial. And then also check to make sure that your middle number is even. If your middle number is not even, then it's not possible to write that polynomial as the square of a binomial. So we're going to do just one more here, which is part G. Part G is 49x squared plus 14xy, and then plus y squared. So our first term is a square. 49 is the square of 7, and then x squared, of course, is the square of x. So we have 7x quantity squared. Our last term is a y squared. So now we need to see, is this middle term the double of the product? So plus 2 times 7x times y. 2 times 7 is 14 times x times y is going to be 14xy. So that means that we can write this as 7x plus y quantity squared. So that again was number 8, which is just like number 15 that I assigned as homework. I do recommend that before you try to write any of these polynomials as the square of a binomial, that you first check to make sure that your last term, your constant, is positive, because if it is negative, then it is not possible to write that polynomial as the square of a binomial. And also check to make sure that your middle term is even. If your middle term is not even, then you cannot write it as the square of a binomial. Okay, so now we're going to look at number 9. Number 9 says find the values of the following expressions for the values of x indicated. So this is going to be just like number 16 that I assigned as homework. And what they did here is they give you a couple of different values of x. X equals 1, x equals 3, x equals 10. They gave you 2 more values, but that's all I'm going to do. And they gave you 2 different equations. X squared plus 10x plus 25. And then also x plus 5 squared. And they want you to plug x equals 1 into both of these equations and compare your answers. Then plug x equals 3 in, then plug x equals 10 in. So if I plug x equals 1 into this first equation, 1 squared is just 1. 10 times 1 is 10. And then I have a 25. 1 plus 10 plus 25 is 36. Now I'm going to plug it into this second one. 1 plus 5 is 6, and then we need to square that. 6 squared is 36. Notice we got the same answer. Now we're going to plug in x equals 3. 3 squared is 9. 10 times 3 is 30. And then we copy down the 25. So 9 plus 30 plus 25, that's going to be 64. Now we're going to plug our 3 into the second equation. 3 plus 5 is 8, and when we square that, we get 64. Okay, so now we're going to try x equals 10. So 10 squared is 100, so we start off with 100. 10 times 10 is another 100. And then we write down our 25. 100 plus 100 plus 25 is 225. Now we'll plug our 10 into our other equation. 10 plus 5 is 15. And the square of 15 is 225. Now, if you'll notice, x plus 5 squared is x squared plus the double of 5 times x plus 5 squared, which is x squared plus 10x plus 25. So these are equivalent. They are equal. So whichever one you plug your value in for x, you should get the same answer. So when you do number 16, you will also have equivalent equations. You should get the same answer both ways. If you do not get the same answer, then you've done something wrong. Go back and check your work. Okay, that was number 9, which is just like number 16. So the next one we're going to do is the last problem here, which is number 10. And number 10 says factor each of the following polynomials. So for these, you just need to factor it as far as you can. So we're going to look first at part A, which is x to the 4th plus 22x squared plus 121. So looking at this, I can see my first term and my last term are both squares. And my middle term is an even number. So maybe this is the square of a binomial, since that's what this lesson is about. So my first term I can write as x squared squared. My last term I can write as 11 squared. My middle term is that double of my first term times my last term. Well, 2 times 11 times x squared is 22x squared, so it is. That means that I can write this as x squared plus 11 squared. Okay, so now let's look at part C. So part C is x to the 10th plus 2, sorry, that's a plus, 2x to the 5th, y to the 5th, plus y to the 10th. Okay, again, I can see that my first and last terms are squares, and my middle term is definitely an even number. So I'm going to try to see if it works as the square of a binomial. My first term I can write as a square, x to the 5th squared. My last term I can write as y to the 5th squared. And then my middle term should be the double of my first term times my last term, and it is. So I can write this equation as x to the 5th plus y to the 5th squared. So now I'm going to look at part E. Okay, part E is 5x to the 4th minus 50x squared plus 125. Well, none of these terms are squares, so that's not going to work here. But notice that all of our coefficients are multiples of 5. Anytime you have a common term, you should go ahead and factor that out. So I'm going to factor out my greatest common factor. 5 times what is 5x to the 4th? That's going to be x to the 4th. 5 times what is negative 50x squared? That's negative 10x squared. 5 times what is 125? Well, that is 25. Okay, now looking at this, you can see that we start with a square, we end with a square, and we have an even number in the middle. So let's see if this works out as the square of a binomial. Excuse me, this first term I can write as x squared squared. The last term I can write as 5 squared. And then in the middle, I'm going to subtract double the product of the first term and the last term. Is 2 times x squared times 5 equal to 10x squared? It is. So that means that I can write this as 5. We can't throw this away. We have to keep it. 5 times x squared minus 5, and we square that. So that's how we would factor part E. So we're going to do just one more, which is part F. Oh, I'll go ahead and do two more. I'll do part D, which is 2x squared minus 12x plus 18. Notice these are all even numbers. That means I can pull out a 2, which will leave me with x squared minus 6x plus 9. This first number is a square, x squared. The last number is a square, that's 3 squared. Our term in the middle is the double of the product of our first term and our last term. That means that we can write this as 2 times x minus 3 squared. Okay, then part F is 16x squared minus 8x to xy to the 8th plus y to the 16th. Okay. There is no common term that we can factor out of this because x's only appear in the first two terms and y's only appear in the last two terms, and only our first two terms are even. So our first number we can write as 4x squared. Our last one we can write as y to the 8th squared. And then our middle is double of our first term times our last term. So we can write this as 4x plus y to the 8th squared. Oh, I'm sorry, not plus. 4x minus y to the 8th, and then we square it. So I'll rewrite that 4x minus y to the 8th, and it's squared. So that's how we do this. This is number 10, which is just like number 17 that I assigned for homework.